It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. What's up? What's happening? I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen. And Logan, this is the earliest we have ever recorded a podcast. Because I want that noted for the record book. It is currently 6:56 in the morning. But we're grinders. We're doing it.
We're grinding. Yeah, you get up early though. Like you're training guys. You're up early.
I do. I have a wonderful woman named Molly who I train twice a week at 7 a.m.
Yeah.
This is not one of those days I'm typically up this early.
So you're sleeping in right now, man. That's all.
Normally I got we need a warm up for the podcast, if you will. While the client's doing her warm up, I can kind of come to mentally. It's different demand here.
Yeah, no doubt.
On what we're doing. So here's what we got. Here's the warm-up, right? Let's set a plan, if you will, a session plan. We're going to talk about OTAs. Obviously, they didn't wind up doing anything on Tuesday. They wound up canceling that practice, just had some meetings and kind of a more fun day, and then sent everybody home for the summer. So we will just go our kind of big takeaways from OTAs. Then stock up, stock down on players through the spring, and then our three biggest training camp questions. That's all still to come on this edition of Take Command. So let's start with kind of the big picture. What do you come out of the spring knowing that you didn't know going in?
Knowing that I didn't know going in, that's a really good question. Knowing I don't know anything at this point, I'll say that things that have been informed, I think a little bit more. I think is I'm really excited about where the secondary is going for this team. I think obviously Cam Curl didn't practice, so it's not exactly finalized. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But in terms of guys showing you things that make you feel really good about the direction that group is going, Forbes I thought had an excellent OTA minicamp period. Quan also, I mean, his role was a little bit different. Forbes was kind of getting that starter type role, and Quan's still trying to establish that role. Right. Percy Butler I thought looked great at times, listen to Kimes podcast, like his speed, like that's something I agree with. To me, I'm still so cautious with those young safeties. Forrest also, because there was no runs in this, and while safety is the position and the demands of that position have changed pretty dramatically, like they still are run players. So how does that look once you get the pads on, once EB's doing some more run stuff and they have to fit runs and kind of negotiate play action, negotiate short game to long concepts. So that's interesting. And I actually thought Fuller, a guy we haven't talked about a ton, was just super consistent, and him and Terry always have interesting battles. And I think one of the things with Fuller is it's so hard to evaluate him because he's so smart and he just figures out like what's happening, like almost the first day. It's like, how did he know that was coming? And so I think as we get deeper into camp, for me, Fuller, obviously they played pretty good last year, obviously ups and downs, but on the whole, pretty consistent in terms of what Jack wanted and philosophically what Jack was looking for. But a guy that I think I won't really know where he's at until they get to that Baltimore practice. But again, everyone did really well. Defense in the back end looked really good. And if that group continues to progress the way they look during OTAs and minicamp, it's going to be a scary group, man. The defense is going to be really, really scary because I think it elevates every other aspect of this team.
Yeah, definitely. For whatever it's worth, I don't know why I didn't think of this before. Fuller is the one guy that has extensive experience against this offense because he used to, be with the Chiefs and practice against it. So maybe some of the recognition stuff is, not just because he's brilliant, but because it is that familiar. Does come back a little quicker for him. But generally speaking, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that the secondary has done what you'd hope for. But in the same way we talk about with how this is not all really set up for him to be super successful because of the lack of or the one-dimensional nature of these practices, that should mean there's advantages for the defense that are built in. And, their ability to be exactly where they need to be is affected by the fact that they're not seeing run. But you also can't take off points for them doing the right thing.
Correct.
It's like, oh yeah, hey, you didn't have to think about this other thing, but you did what all we could ask you to do. Sorry, you didn't accidentally mess up a couple times to make it look more real. Like that's not a thing. So yeah. I think it's really, like you said, it's really encouraging knowing Curl's coming. And to your point, the last thing that you said, something I just kind of want to underscore, kind of looking ahead. If the secondary can be 2% better, Like we
Yeah.
did all those over-unders with Nick, and the sack numbers were some of the big ones that we talked about with Montez. How does he finish more plays? And it was, he had a pretty hilarious answer last week. How do you finish more plays? I just got to get there, man. I just got to get the guy down. But it's also like, well, okay, how do you get there? How do you buy that extra tenth of a second so that the quarterback hits that Sweat is registering become sacks? The coverage is 1% better, not even 1%,
Right.
right? So if they as a whole, as a unit, can become better, it's going to make that pass rush so much more effective. And I think obviously we'll talk more about Chase as we go here at some point in one of these topics. But if he's there and is a more effective pass rusher, James and Casey did a tremendous job being solid and doing what they were asked to do last year. But you bring that extra juice of a Chase Young, that's going to obviously help create some turnovers and things in the back end as well. And the addition of a guy like Forbes, who that's his calling card.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is just seeing how quickly the defensive line gelled together. We can kind of do that more in stock up, stock down, but
Yeah.
that is one thing too that I think was
High level, right?
encouraging. Big takeaways, like we had all these nerves about Sweat and especially Young coming in here, and how would they gel with their teammates? Would anybody be mad? Is there worry about contracts? And it's like, no, they were ready to play football. And so I think that was definitely encouraging as well. We can talk about that more in a moment. My big takeaway is on the other side of the ball. And that is just how influential Eric Bieniemy is going to be on this football team. And that is one thing, you said, I don't know anything yet, but I'm informed on this. I know Eric Bieniemy has a massive, massive impact on this football team, from the kind of, like, I'll call it organizational structure, like how they, it's really more team structure than organizational structure, how they are, putting together their practices, how they are, what time they are practicing, all of these things that Bieniemy very clearly came in and said, not we're going to do this way, but like, this is how I would like to do them. And Ron was like, okay, well, that's how we do them. I think that is pretty fascinating for an offensive coordinator to come in. And obviously he's the assistant head coach as well. But to see just how influential he is, I think was really, cool, because it was different. And I like things. I like being exposed to new things. But I think it's also going to be more effective for them. And then my question is, kind of moving forward, like, how does that influence the season? Beyond the same ways that it influenced the offseason, practice times, practice structures, things like that. Are there, whether it's the way they play in terms of some of the kind of bigger inter-team stuff, like, does he get to kind of push back on some of the run first philosophy and, looking out for the defense in the ways that I think Ron had imagined coming out of last season, accomplishing the same goals, but in the way that Eric wants to? Is there any eventual friction there? Are there, fourth down decisions, or, an aggression, or what, other ways in which the head coach typically makes certain decisions that Bieniemy will be more heavily involved in, or just flat out be making himself? Those are the things that I'm curious about going into the season on that front. But from a general standard, a general structure standpoint, Bieniemy's impact was, like, to me, by far and away the biggest thing I take out of the spring.
Yeah, I agree. And that'll be interesting too to kind of watch, like you mentioned the relationships between him and Ron, like how does that progress? How does that develop? And when, again, like the offense I thought looked pretty good, and, EB's leadership style I think is perfect for what this team needs, but how does that continue to develop? I think, NFL teams are funny, man. NFL players are funny. They're very they're very proud guys, And so when someone's on you like that and really demanding, like some people rubs some people the wrong way. I don't think EB. I think he understands that. I think he does a good job of saying, like, I respect you. I'm going to coach the hell out of you, And I think, like, as long as that's clear, guys are gonna gravitate towards that. But I've had conversations with guys who are like, if the team's not doing well and EB's still coaching like this, like, what's going to happen, And I think that's always important to consider. But as of right now, I think his impact, like you said, is something that you can kind of definitively say, yes, he's done a great job of kind of laying the foundation for training camp. But like with anything, we got to see how it progresses. We just need more data points. That's the other thing that's crazy, is we're making all these kind of broad assumptions and assertions off of 8 practices, whatever it is. So
Yeah.
I think that's that also makes it somewhat challenging. But I do agree. I think his impact's been enormous. And I'm cautiously optimistic about the direction this group is going, and the offense is going to be a huge part of that, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. The way that people react to EB during the season, I think, is something that I'm kind of keeping an eye on. He has been in a winning environment the last however many years he was in Kansas City. And I guess not all of it, but like, yeah, no, since he's been there, because it was
They've
Alex
been
and
pretty
Mahomes. He
good.
wasn't there.
They've been pretty
He
good.
wasn't there for the stuff previous to that. So he hasn't had to deal with, kind of any extended losing.
Right.
And that is something that is different to navigate. And hopefully, obviously, it'd be pretty sweet if they didn't have to deal with that here this year.
Yeah.
If they're able to be an above 500 team, if there are no losing streaks, if there are no, there's always moments of tension, and they're all relative. A 2-game skid in Kansas City is like end of the world type of stuff, considering what their standard is and what they've been and their desires to win a Super Bowl. Here, obviously, I don't want to say the standard isn't that, because that's the ultimate goal, but the pressure is not there because no one reasonably expects them to do that. There's not that external pressure, and I would assume there's not internal pressure. There's a lot more focus on growth and kind of intangible things in a lot of ways, that will lead to championships, but it's not like, hey, we have to win the Super Bowl this year, or this season is a failure. So how does he adjust to that throughout the season if he has to? I'd have to look back at the rosters, but how young this roster is compared to what some of he's had in Kansas City. They've always kind of had some vets around. Fuller obviously is there as a vet. But outside of that, there's just not a lot of old, guys that are, let's say, older than 27 on this roster, especially in starting key positions. He does have some, I guess, maturity along the offensive line in that way. Guys like Leno, guys like Wiley. But this is such a young roster that how do they respond to that kind of intensity of coaching throughout the season is something else that I had in mind. The last thing I wanted to ask real quick, Logan, on OTAs, and then we'll get to stock up, stock down, is the idea that they skip this final practice to me is a nothing. At that point, it's one practice. Who cares? And the analogy I made on the radio is it's kind of like going to the gym. No single workout is going to be the one that makes the difference for you one way or the other, unless it's the one you get hurt at. That's the only way any single workout is the one that makes a huge difference. Other than that, it's about stacking days. And that's how you ultimately get to where you want to go in a fitness setting, which of course is really what football practice is. But is it a big deal that they missed 3 practices? Because the reason they skipped the one is because they already had 2 taken away from them for what happened in OTAs last year, where there was too much contact. So 1, no big deal, probably the smart thing. Just get to the summer healthy. You can do what you need to do in meetings, etc. But what would another full week of practice have meant to them?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One, I think, this is more of like a personal touchy-feely type thing. I think canceling this practice, I don't want to say it's a Santa. It's one of those things that kind of like rubs guys in the locker room a little bit the wrong way. And people say, why? Like, do they want to practice? It's like you make your off-season plans around this practice, and so you've planned to be here for this practice, and then all of a sudden it's canceled or whatever, and you're like, well, we're here for like a nothing day. Like we didn't really get practice. Like I was staying for that. So I do think that is something that is a little bit probably frustrating for some guys in the locker room. It's like I could have been out of here. I could have been back with my family or back in my hometown or back on my vacation or whatever I'm doing. So that's something to just keep an eye on. In terms of the 2 practices, obviously, like the old school player version of me is like, oh man, that's huge. You're never going to get those reps back. But really, when you think about it, when you take a step back, even if you're starting, even if you're participating a lot in the OTAs and minicamp, you're getting 5 to 10, 15 plays a day, so 30 total reps. And in the grand scheme of the season, in the grand scheme of training camp, in the grand scheme even of the OTA minicamp kind of rep distribution, like it's a very, very small percentage of stuff. So it's really just kind of 2 extra days of study and preparation. Ron mentioned that they've been able to get all of their installs in. It's like a 10-day install, and then they have 2 days of kind of review. So I from that standpoint, it's not you've already installed that during kind of the first week of offseason program phase 1. You've installed your offense. You've installed it again here, and I just think it's kind of like one of those things where my knee jerk player reaction is that, oh my gosh, this is a huge deal, but also like you have training camp coming up, you have preseason work to kind of supplement this, and in the grand scheme of prep for the season, it's probably not that big of a deal. It's just kind of going over stuff you've already gone over, hashing out some details. And I honestly think just based on the structure of practice, that what they've been doing as of right now, it's probably not, like a huge thing. And I know that's hard for fans to like understand, but I think your gym analogy is good. It's like it's these days are not necessary. Let's put it that way. They're not necessary to the off-season install. And so they're just kind of your auxiliary days to kind of continue the strength and conditioning analogy. It's like, oh, we're hitting back and bicep today. And is that going to help my deadlift down the road? Sure. But is it absolutely necessary that I get those days? Probably not. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's that significant. I think the more significant factor is just kind of like the general irritation that some of the players probably have at this point, not being able to get out of here, kind of saying, hey, we're going to be here, we're going to have a productive day. And then kind of, not doing that, I think is always, guys they grumble about all sorts of stuff. You've been around the locker room, Craig. It doesn't take a lot to get those guys pissed off. So that would be the one thing that I'd say is probably significant about it.
That was one thing I thought about. If I was a player, I'd be pretty annoyed about that.
Yeah.
Like, why couldn't you just cancel it last week?
Because then I would be out of here. I'd be back to where I'm going on Friday of last week, right? So that's the one. That's the only thing I think that's even a little bit relevant to this is just.
And even then, it's like, what is the real trickle down of that? Unless they like keep jerking guys around and whatever. Yeah. But
and honestly, and to be fair to the coaching staff, they may have fully intended to have practice, and then so many guys didn't come back for this practice. They didn't. They just kind of because this is an OTA day, right?
Yeah, this was voluntary. So
a lot of guys just probably said, "Hey, I'm out of here," and then they don't have enough guys to like practice. They're like, "Well, what are we going to do?"
So, it also sounded like they, Ron, the way it was presented through the media, when whoever Ron or whoever, talking to Keim and Nikki and Standig and everybody was like, Ron talked to Bieniemy, he talked to Jack. They were fully satisfied with where they were, and they were like, "What's the point?"
Right.
So, if they were happy with, they didn't anticipate things going so well through minicamp, and they hadn't had those meetings yet. Like, it's just the logistics of life, Logan. The logistics of life. But it is kind of annoying if you're a player. But then again, like if you're one of the top guys, you might have just planned on not going anyway. And
that's what I'm saying. So there's
if you're a younger guy, you have to be at those meetings that they had instead anyway, because you can't be like, yeah, well, I'm going on vacation, I'm good with my install, even though I'm the 78th guy and have a 0.3% chance of making the team.
Right. Absolutely. It's just one of those things. It's like that's something that I know. I've been around locker rooms that just bothers guys. It's like, why are we here for this day? And
because you want to make the team and it's your job.
Correct.
And you don't have to work again for 6 weeks. I would also like to take July off from my job because you goobers are going to be doing whatever, and I don't have a lot to talk about. NBA free agency, please be interesting. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Greg Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. All right, little stock up, stock down, Logan. Let's try to get one player each, stock up, one player each, stock down. The stock down, I feel like, is actually going to be difficult, which is a good thing. You don't want guys just tanking in the spring. Stock up for me. I'm going to go Chase Young. I'll start, and I'll go Chase Young.
Wow, that's a bold one off of 2 days of practice, my guy.
Well, here's the thing. I think we're not talking about all of a sudden Chase is like back to being, I expect him to have 14 sacks a year, go to the Hall of Fame, like whatever. But I do think that like when he showed up, he looked good and he interacted well with everybody. And there seemed to be genuinely no resentment about him, missing out. And some of that is Rivera being a professional, right? Stock up Ron Rivera on that front. He handled it as a head coach as well as you can possibly handle that situation if you do not want conflict. And if he is privately annoyed, that hasn't gotten out. They have said it's voluntary. He's doing what he's got to do, and I think they're at this point with him in a big like, we'll see. Proof will be when you actually get out there and play. But at the end of the day, like, he came back, the interaction was great. He was Chase. He's barking on the sideline. He's bringing the energy. He's doing all this stuff. Like, his press conference was kind of annoying. He seems to still have a very, high sense of self and all those kinds of things that I think are, I don't want to say worrisome, but like that rub some people the wrong way. But he ultimately like came out and looked good and felt like himself for the first time since he shredded his knee. And
right.
if that's, if we're talking about an added value or, staying exactly where we thought he was, like, that's good. Some of the questions, I don't want to say have been answered. Let me put it this way. Not all of the questions have been answered, but some of the questions have been answered, and they've been answered in the way that you'd hope they get answered. Teammates responded well. That's good. His knee is definitely, and his health and his fitness is definitely in a significantly better place than it was at the end of the season. We still don't know how effective he'll be in actual NFL games. We can't know that at this point. But like, boxes checked for Chase in the spring, and that's all, in the same way that we've talked about so much of this stuff. There's only so much he could do at this point, but he did that stuff. And for that reason, stock up.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, yeah, I get it. And really, what's he going to show during this period anyway? As a player, I think it's all like kind of optics, and I think it's just good to see him get over the bags and get off. Watching his get off on what day was that? Tuesday of last week. Like, he looked sharp. He looked explosive. Like, he looked back, and those things are important.
He looked better than he did in the games last year.
Yeah. In terms of stock up, stock down for me, stock up, I'm going to say Logan Thomas, but also just kind of the tight end position group in general. I really feel like,
stunner coming from you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like during this period, the Logan Thomas specifically has been the most consistent offensive player. He's just been excellent, understanding zones, making contested catches, developing that relationship with Sam, and then kind of to trickle down, like, Cole Turner has kind of been that guy that we thought he was going to be last year during training camp, kind of continuing that, ability to beat linebackers, kind of aggressive hands to the football. Curtis Hodges has come along, and John Bates has had a really couple productive days over the course of the 8-day period, making some tough contested catches. So that group to me looks poised for something really good, and that's exciting for me. And we'll see what happens. Obviously, we'll see how they do with the pads on. That position is a little bit more physical than others, so the pads are a big part of it. But in terms of where they're at right now, I'm excited about the projection of that group. So
yeah, I'm trying to think of someone for stock down, and I don't really know who had any, even on a relative nature. Kind of what I was talking about with Chase. Like, I don't know anyone in particular who had a bad spring. I mean, Jacoby Brissett's chances at starting, because Sam did what he needed to do. Like, what
maybe. I mean, he was fine. To me, the guy that sticks out to me is like Jamin, for example. And it's not because Jamin did anything wrong necessarily. Right. It's just because, like, the guys who were there, like Cody Barton, Khaleke Hudson, even Mayo had a pretty solid spring, and so it kind of went from, oh no, what are we going to do without Jamin there? To Jack and his presser being like, man, guys are playing good. We're not that worried about Jamin not being here for this offseason. So I think that just kind of from a 1,000-foot view, if you had to pick somebody, you'd say, what's going on with him? Where's he at? And again, I think Jamin's poised for a big year. Hopefully they're ready to support him with that, playing behind that defensive line. Hopefully we see more of that athleticism, that physicality that we saw the last 4 games of last year. But in terms of off-season work, he didn't do it. And the guys who were doing it did a really good job. So his absence becomes a little bit less acute, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so that gives me one. In that same vein, I'll go Cam Curl. Because, we had that great question on Monday of like, is there a situation where Curl doesn't get paid? And, it's, I guess, that they don't need to pay him. Is right. That they have Derek Forrest and Percy Butler and Quan Martin and even down to Jeremy Reeves for depth, that they look at Cam Curl and it's like, look, man, if you can get top 5 safety money somewhere else, go do it. But like, we got to pay these edge guys, or we got to pay one of the edge guys. We got to do this. We got to do that. And just from a salary cap standpoint, you're awesome. We love you. But like, well, we did a good job drafting, and your replacement's here. His name's Quan Martin. Thanks for helping bringing him along in his rookie year. So in that way, like Cam did everything right for a guy that is, holding in kind of ish. He denies that it's about the contract, but why else wouldn't he be out there doing stuff? He not only was, kind of on the side and in the meetings, like he was behind the defense, getting mental reps, like really being able to see it from, 30 yards behind the play, 50 yards behind the play. But at the end of the day, these other guys played really well. And, how much do you want to pay even a top performing safety that is part of this rotation that isn't significantly worse without him? That would be the question, though. Is it significantly worse without him? That we're not going to know till, again, the Baltimore practices, till games. And, Cam last year was the most valuable player on that defense. When he was in, they were good. When he was out, they were bad. And so from that perspective, like, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about practice. We're talking about spring practice. We're talking about 0 run plays, etc. But I guess based off the criteria that we've established here, relatively speaking, stock down for Cam Curl and, leverage of his contract negotiations, because these young guys look like they're ready to play. And, at that point, do you spend that money? Still probably yes, but just, we're pulling teeth here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, and again, it's splitting hairs, really. We're not trying to like say that Cam's not a good player or Cam's not going to make the team
awesome.
or any of that.
I would
stuff.
still pay him in a heartbeat.
I think it just was an opportunity for the young guys to come in, like including Percy Butler, including Forrest and Quan, like you mentioned, and just say, hey, like we're really good. We're good football players. We got a path to be playing some good football for this team and for this organization. And when you see that kind of scaffolding develop around that position and have all these pieces that can come in and play, I don't want to say it devalues Cam, but it basically says, like, I had people asking me, like, probably midway through training camp, like, do you see a path where they don't re-sign Cam Curl? And that was one of the questions we got on the show, but like some of the guys were asking me about it. And it's like, after watching this, it's like, maybe because of how good everybody's looked, and that's good for the team. That's good for the organization. I think Cam is better still. I think Cam is kind of, I don't want to say elite, but like a game changing type player, especially for this defense. And his role is so comprehensive that I don't think they move on from him, obviously. But I think it allowed other people to kind of be like, hey, like we're maturing, we're growing, and put us in a good spot. And I feel the same way about Jamin. Like, I think Jamin's still going to be, the starting Mike or Will linebacker, whatever that is. But I think now all of a sudden people have had time to develop. Like, these reps in practice for a guy like Khaleke Hudson are huge. And it just says, like, hey, we have more depth here. We have some development that we weren't expecting. And so maybe we feel a little bit differently about the total composition of the position.
Totally. But, as we said, what happens when the run game's implemented? The whole equation changes. So all this, these stock prices, if you will, are very fluid. They're going very up and down.
Yeah. And I think it's also like important to note that, like, it's as much as it's, what's the word I'm looking for? As much as these things are really good, like, that the depth has somehow changed. Like, it's still like they don't have pads on. It's still limited offensive production. Like, this is going to change pretty dramatically, I think, here. Like, even these analyses will change. So,
yeah. So it's June 14th. It's now 7:24 in the morning. Nobody hold us to a word that we're saying. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulson there. If you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you are not as well. And of course, if you are listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you're not already a subscriber, another podcast platform, you're not already a subscriber, we'd love to have you each and every week, twice a week here on Take Command. So, Logan, let's quickly rifle through 3 major questions entering training camp. Or what do we think are the 3 biggest questions entering training camp? We obviously have about 6 weeks or so until then. July 27th, training camp opens. That was announced yesterday. We also got some reporting last night that there might be one, I don't want to call it fairly significant, the most significant day before that. And this is actually the first one to me in terms of things affecting training camp, and it goes right on the heels of our last discussion. there is a really good chance that the ownership transfer is final, that the sale is completed either July 20th or August 8th. NFL owners have been told, per multiple reports, to save those dates for being available, going to wherever it is, whether they go to New York, the league office, whether they meet somewhere kind of in the Midwest, more middle of the country, to get together and vote. And then once Josh Harris gets implemented, you have everything open for business. You have contract negotiations that you can talk about with guys like Cam Curl. You have any upgrades you want to make to the stadium and or practice facility, that new equipment, all these types of things can all of a sudden be back on the table again. So one, is there any difference to you between July 20th, a week before, and August 8th in the middle of training camp? And two, do you think that anything in particular will get going pretty quickly, or is it, are we kind of already past the window when an ownership change can affect the 2023 season in any meaningful way?
I mean, I think the only thing that I see kind of potentially being affected is the Cam Curl thing, and just how, like, or Cam Curl or Montez, any kind of contract extension, any kind of money that needs to be brought in. I think those are the things that kind of are looming. I really, I run a small business of like me, basically, and
Right.
It's very, very hard to quickly get anything done, because there's like legal hurdles outside of the structure of like the team, and so when you come into a new organization, I'm sure you've got to get used to personnel, the structure. You got to bring in your own people, you got to make hires. So I think maybe from that standpoint, like some of the people in the like the marketing or the sales side, there might be some turnover there, especially at the VP level within the organization. But I think from a football standpoint, you're not going to see like any kind of dramatic effects, because what's he going to do? I mean, like, what's Josh Harris?
Yeah.
What is he capable of doing? Everyone talks about the practice facility or the stadium. Like, those are long projects, right? Selling the practice field in Ashburn, that's probably a 2-year, maybe a year out type of thing.
Well, even like if they want to do some kind of construction, like at that point, you don't necessarily like, unless it's a construction project that can be done in 3 days, like you knock down a wall and install a video monitor or whatever, a projection screen. Like, you don't want to be disruptive at that point of the year. Like there is a very set schedule every day of training camp and then ultimately of the season. Could they potentially do some very small but impactful work in that kind of period between the end of training camp and week one? Hey, we're gonna build a new meeting room because we're gonna take out a couple of offices and we can get it done in 5 days, maybe. But like anything major, significant, it's too late.
Yeah, and even that I'd probably be a little bit skeptical of, just because, like, I've been, they did a couple of construction projects around the facility. It just takes longer than you think, and so you don't want that, like, like the contractor says it'll take 5 days. There's always something that comes up that takes a little bit longer.
Anyone who's ever done anything on a house knows.
Yeah, and you don't want that bleeding into the season, because guys, it is disruptive. It is, like, as much as that's like, oh my gosh, how it just is, like, it affects your workspace, it affects your daily schedule. So I think he'd probably avoid that. I'm just assuming. I think it's going to be more hirings and firings on the non-football operations side, to kind of get the business stuff, the business kind of infrastructure set up, and those will be pretty dramatic right away. But I don't know if the fans will see that like immediately, like see the results of that immediately, I guess. So I think either of those dates, it probably doesn't do too much, except maybe give Ron and Marty, or the Martys, a go ahead to say, hey, let's get Cam Curl done. And that's something that I could see happening.
Right. And even on the business side, like, I think a lot of this season, like if he had been able to be here in May, that's a different scenario in terms of maybe he makes some of these businessy changes going into the season. And hey, we want to do a different media plan or a different marketing plan. And I'm picking random departments.
Yeah,
I'm not being specific in any way. But like our game presentation, I really like what we do with the Devils or the Sixers, and I want to bring some of those people or some of those ideas here. Like, people are working through the summer to put all this stuff together. Like, and there's only so much time to organize.
It's probably been established in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And so there's going to be a whole lot of observing from Josh Harris, and he might install some people to do that observing for him.
Correct.
But there's ultimately only so much you can do. And I don't think that there's a huge deal between July 20th and August 8th, other than how much time do do the media outlets in town, specifically perhaps 2 radio stations, have time to plan very special shows for that day,
Yeah.
and any kind of celebrations that might happen. All right, next biggest question is the quarterback position, obviously. And this one, I'm going to ask you a question I asked Ben Standig on the radio yesterday, which is, if they're going to have this be a true competition, at some point, Jacoby would need 1 reps.
Yes.
What is the thing that would open the door for that, to have that truly, like, it's always a competition because they're evaluating each and every day, but to have
Sure.
it be more of a direct head-to-head competition, what opens the door from Sam Howell to welcome Jacoby Brissett into that?
To kind of think a couple things. One, I think if he comes in and has like a multi-day skid, you know what I
Mhm.
mean, where it looks too fast for him. Like he just can't kind of handle it. And I've seen that happen. I've like in different places I've been, like with backup quarterbacks, where they've kind of been getting a little bit more burn, and they've gone with a 3 going with the 2s, or a 2 going with the 1s, and you're like, oh wow, I'm excited for this guy. I like this guy. Let's see what happens, and it just kind of melts away. Any kind of charisma or dexterity that they had developed is gone. So I think that would be something that would be pretty telling. Like, let's say they get, day 3, 4, 5 of OTAs, he takes a little stumble, or a mini camp or a training camp takes a little stumble, which you would expect. We talked about how that's kind of a tipping point for installs and stuff. And then that continues for a couple of days.
Yeah.
That's something I would think about. And then also, obviously, the Baltimore practice, like let's say Jacoby comes out and just looks really sharp, and Sam is having a hard time with what the defense is presenting him. I think that would be something that would be really telling. Outside of that, it's hard for me to see, because, like, if OTA is a minicamp or any indication, like, he'd have a couple rough days. He had a rough period, but on the whole, I was impressed with his consistency,
Yeah.
and I can't imagine him kind of faltering too badly. But if he does, like, those are the things. Like, if I'm the coach, like, you got to make the decision that's best for the team. And if it looks too fast for him or too big for him, you probably make that transition. And it might be really gradual. It might be like over the course of a couple days. Like, hey, Jacoby, you're taking two reps with the first team, and it'll be really subtle, and it might grow or it might decrease, because sometimes people do that actually to help the starter. If they're coming along having a hard time, just limiting the challenging reps for them. So we'll see what happens, but that would be the only thing that I would consider changing. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, same. If it looks too fast for him, and I think if the turnovers continue, some of the turnover problems that he's had in OTAs are, the small windows, the lack of run, like the one dimensional nature of it, just a really hard test, and he's scored the way that you think he would score, which is both positive and negative. He's a second year guy who doesn't have a lot of experience. There's going to be mistakes, and the question is, can he start eliminating some of those once you have a more dynamic, play calling array in practice? And so if he's turning the ball over a ton, I think you have to start introducing some reps for Jacoby, and then depending on how Sam responds to that, how Jacoby responds, I think it's got to happen. The biggest thing, Logan, is before the Baltimore practices. Like, Jacoby's first 1 reps, if they are happening before the Baltimore practices, and then you get those Baltimore practices to kind of be the final test, and maybe you're splitting more evenly in those practices. But you can't have Sam just get to the Baltimore practices having taken all the reps, him not perform well there, and then be like, okay, we're switching quarterbacks. To me, that seems irresponsible. I guess you could, because
Well,
you're relying on Brissett's experience, but at that point, like, you've kind of set Jacoby up in a bad spot too, because he hasn't actually worked with the guys that he's going to have to win football games with, and that seems like a bad idea too.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why you bring Jacoby, and I think it's one of the reasons we were advocating for Jacoby. And obviously, I think he can play at a starting caliber level for spurts in his career, and he's done a nice job of that. He's a great leader. But I think one of the things that I think and I value about him, and I think they value about him, is that being a good backup means you don't need those 1 reps, right? And so that was something that at points in my career I had to navigate, right? Like, I'm not getting any reps with the 1s, but I had to make sure that I was ready for that level of game speed, because I knew I would be in certain situations because of injury or whatever it was. And so that was, I think, one of the reasons I was valuable, especially later in my career, is because, like, they knew that I'd be ready from an intellectual standpoint, and physically I'd be ready. Like, I was always going to be in shape, and I'd always be ready to go. And that's not fair. It's not fair to the player, but that's the expectation, quite frankly. And I'm not sure if that, I'm totally, this is total speculation. I haven't talked to anybody in the building about this, but just knowing Jacoby's career, knowing kind of his reputation, I would assume that that's kind of how they feel about it, quite honestly,
Yeah.
right? Like that they just think he's like that's the deal. That's why you're getting paid $10 million is so when it doesn't go well, whether that's during the Baltimore practices, whether that's week 1 of training camp, whether that's week 1 of the season, we expect you to be ready to go. And I think that's why you're paying a little bit of a premium for that backup quarterback spot.
Yeah, no, agreed. If I was Ron and EB, I'd probably get him a couple of 1 reps anyway. Just be like, hey, man, like we've had situations, we've had so much injury problems the last couple of years at quarterback. It's smart to have a little bit of a base.
I think in a perfect world they would do that. I just think the media here would see those, those 5 reps in a practice and be like, oh my gosh, Jacoby's taking over the position, and make a big storyline about it. So knowing,
maybe
having been on that side of it too, like this is going to sound crazy, but coaches consider that because they know that the second that happens,
to an extent, but like it's how will it affect the player? And if Ron's going to come out and be like, hey, this isn't a big deal. We're just, we're cross-training guys. We want to make sure there's a little bit of reps, a little bit of familiarity. We want Jacoby to throw to Terry every once in a while.
Those questions come up for the team. Like the offense starts getting asked those questions. Guys in the locker room start talking about it. And so I'm not saying that right or wrong. I just could see him not doing that because of that kind of media. The media here, like, I'm a part of it now, is one of the toughest markets that I ever played in my career. I played in 5 different markets, and this is a brutal market for that kind of stuff. Like, for example, in Atlanta, like Atlanta, Chicago, they're asking you the softest lollipop questions. Guys like barely watch practice. Like it's like, hey, yeah, great. How's it going? And here it's a little bit more investigative, a little bit more cute, and rightfully so. It's a big market. So, but I do think that should be factored in a little bit with some of this stuff, obviously.
All right. Last, and this might actually be the biggest question, is the O-line situation. And, I don't know what we're going to say that's new that hasn't been said already, but like, we don't know what the hell this offensive line is going to look like in terms of performance. Obviously, we know Sadiq is going to get that first shot at left guard. We know all the personnel in the other 4 spots, but like once they put pads on, once they start doing the run game stuff, and they're in more live, like 11 on 11 type of periods with pads, like we're going to find out how good this group is real fast because that defensive line is going to show us.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think, obviously, like Cosme is look good at guard, Wiley's look good at tackle, but like what happens when you're actually pass protecting, like for real with pads on, and you got to move people off the spot? I think Cosme and Wiley will do excellent with that, but like Wiley is like, meeting him, he's not a huge man. Like, you have these expectations of what tackles look like, and he doesn't look like that. He plays well. He's a good football player. So like, I'm excited that he's here, but how do you handle like one of the best power rushers in the NFL, in Montez Sweat or Chase Young? Like how does your frame accommodate that? Like what technical things are you going to be doing to kind of put yourself in a better position to win those one-on-one matchups? That's something that I'm really, really curious to see. The left guard spot, again, is something that I'm really interested in just because it's kind of like, Sadiq has looked good at times in practice. You see the athleticism, you see the explosion. I think you see a much kind of smarter, much more in tune player. But again, they haven't been doing the whole offense. They haven't been doing the runs, and the pads aren't on. So the group is really interesting. It's really, really interesting because there's a lot of people in new spots, a lot of question marks. And so, to me, that's even more than Sam Howell, which I know sounds crazy, but we got to see a pretty good sample size of Sam. He was getting, probably 20 throws of practice, 25 throws of practice in team kind of settings, 7-on-7, team pass, 2-minute, whatever it is. And, as much as that's limiting, you get a pretty good evaluation, a good feel for where the guy's at. With the O-line, there was none of that. So, again, my biggest question going into training camp, that third day of training camp when they put those pads on is what that group looks like and how do they gel and how do they come together. And also really like to your earlier point about biggest takeaways is how does EB help that group? So lots of stuff going on there for sure.
For sure. And I agree with you. It's a bigger story than quarterback in some ways because it's so heavily going to influence quarterback. Like, if these guys are good, good. If these guys are bad, Sam's toast. That's the nature of offensive line play in the NFL. All right. That's it. That's all for this week's show. Well, shows. We do 2 a week, so make sure you are subscribed to get both of them. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is that you get your podcast. Watch full episodes on YouTube at youtube.com/@1067 The Fan. Highlights on my YouTube page, youtube.com/@Craig Hoffman. Next week, we will get into our off-season mode completely. I know Logan has been wanting for months to do who will win an 11-11 football game between 11 linemen and 11 skill guys. So perhaps that's next week, and some more fun questions.
Any kind of game stuff. Like, we're going to be, this is it. This is
Logan's got ideas.
Season.
We're in Logan Paulson silly season, and I'm excited for it. So we'll see you next week for that. It's Take Command from Odyssey Sports. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fan's YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.